Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we'll start the topic of encryption, and it's a pretty big topic. We're only going to scratch the surface today, but we are going to refer to a lot of the things that we've already discussed before, things like the CIA triad, how that is integral to security to begin with, and so on and so forth. So when we say encryption, let's say that you wanted to, let's simplify this a bit, right? Let's say that you wanted to tell somebody something, and maybe you wanted to tell them something that you didn't necessarily want anyone else to know. What would be the simplest method of securing that communication? And when we say securing that communication, let's say that you're not necessarily concerned about them receiving what you wanted to tell them. Let's say that you're not concerned about it being received in the proper way. So we already scratching integrity and availability from that list. You're concerned about somebody impacting or somebody breaching the confidentiality of your conversation. So this is pretty much where encryption kicks in. And this problem of securing a communication and the problem of securing data or information that you're sending to somebody, it has been around for quite a while, right? Pretty much since the ancient times, because even back then, as you can imagine, there was communication going back and forth, and people wanted to make sure that their enemies would not make use of that or would not obtain this information. Because imagine if this was, let's say, the location of troops, or if this was the date of a planned attack, then this is something that you definitely do not want anyone else apart from the correct recipient of that information to receive. So the example that's being given probably the most often is the so-called Caesar cipher, which was, as the name implies, used during the times of Julius Caesar. And this is just to show you that even back then, so many years and centuries ago, people thought of ways to actually achieve that, to actually achieve confidentiality through encryption. And the Caesar cipher is a simple cipher. It falls into the category of the so-called substitution ciphers, where you're basically substituting one character for another one. And if we take the example that is given here, let's say that the upper line is your plain text. This is the message as you have written it down, and the message as you want it to be read on the other end. And if, let's say, the bottom line is the so-called ciphertext, this is the message after it was encrypted. Then in this case, in order for somebody to actually read the message, they have to know that you actually substituted the letter D for the letter A, letter E for the letter B, and so on and so forth. And in this case, this is a shift of 3 characters to the left in order to achieve that. So if you know that if you know that this was the mechanism that was used in order to achieve that, or to put it simply, if you knew what the key was, then you would be able to read the message. So let's say that Julius Caesar sent a message encrypted in this way to somebody, and by sending, in terms of the times that we're talking about, we probably mean somebody actually going over there to deliver the message. If that somebody, if that messenger was, if the message was taken from them along the route, then Caesar's enemies would not have an idea of, well, what the message is about, because it would be encrypted, unless, of course, they knew the key. So this is probably a good moment to point out that encryption is not a panacea in any way, because it still requires you to protect the key that was used to encrypt, and this is why there are good and bad ways of doing encryption to begin with, but we'll talk more about that later. Okay, so now that we've taken this out of the way and we actually saw what a very simple way of encrypting information looks like, make sure to remember these key terms that we mentioned: plaintext and ciphertext. Plaintext is the text before encryption, and ciphertext is the text after encryption. And in the same way, decryption would be the reverse process, right? In order to decrypt something, you're actually converting it from ciphertext to plaintext. Okay. So let's go back to our initial example, right? And you're talking to your friend, and if you want them to understand what you're saying to them without anyone else understanding, then maybe one of the simplest examples would be if you told them your message to them in another language, in a language that only the two of you spoke, right? So maybe you're, I don't know, maybe you're in Australia, and you and the person who you're talking to are speaking Hungarian, for example. There are probably not millions of people in Australia speaking Hungarian. So if you told them your message in Hungarian, then maybe only they will be able to understand it. Even if anyone was listening to your conversation at that particular moment, they would not be able to understand what you're saying, right? So, but then again, if they did know that language, if this would equate to them having the key. So in this case, the encryption will be pointless, because they'll still be able to understand what you're saying to them, to the other person, right? So it's about first encrypting when you're sending the information, or actually before the information is sent, and then decryption happens on the other end. Because think of it this way: if you're only encrypting, but the other side does not have a way to decrypt this information, then you're pretty much doing nothing, right? You need to make sure that you're both on the same page about how this information was encrypted and how it's supposed to be decrypted. In the same way, they might return a message to you saying, okay, so this is what I'm responding back to what you told me. And again, I'm encrypting it in a way that we both have agreed on beforehand. So you can now decrypt it on your side, which is what you see in the bottom part of the picture here. And there are generally two types of encryption that that are out there, two big categories, if you want to put it this way. The first one is the so-called symmetric encryption, or private key encryption. And it's called this way because in order to encrypt information in this way, you need to have a private key. You need to have encrypted, so the information is encrypted with a key that converts it from plain text to ciphertext, and then the other side, the recipient of that information, needs to have that key in order to decrypt the information. Okay, so think of it this way: you have a box that you have put something very, very valuable into, and then you've locked this box with a key, but there's only one key to that box. So you are sending this box to the recipient that's supposed to have it and open it. But then what do you think would be the problem in this case? The problem would be you also need to send the key, right? But you don't send the key along with the box. So the other side needs to have the key in advance, or they need to know how to obtain it, right? So in symmetric encryption, the information is both encrypted and decrypted with the same key. So the problem here is, how do you get the key to the other side? And we'll talk more about that later. This is a whole separate problem that has specific ways to be addressed, but make sure to remember that with symmetric encryption, as the name implies, you both encrypt and decrypt information with the same key. And this has its own pros and cons, right? The obvious downside or the obvious con is what we already said. If somebody is to steal the key somewhere along the route, then they'll be able to decrypt this information. It's as simple as that. If we step into the world of information technology for a moment and get out of the abstraction of what we're showing right now, symmetric encryption is generally faster than the other type of encryption that we'll talk about in a moment, which is called asymmetric encryption. This is its biggest pro compared to the other type. The other type, like we just mentioned, is called asymmetric encryption. And here it's not as simple as with symmetric encryption. So here you have the so-called key pairs. So everyone in the conversation, so both yourself and the other side, you both have a pair of keys each, and each of the pairs contains two keys. You have your private key and you have your public key. The private key, as the name implies, is a key that is supposed to be only in your possession. No one else should be able to access this key, because if they do, this pretty much means that they'll be able to decrypt whatever is being sent to you. The public key, on the other hand, is a key that you could freely share with the outside world, because there's a mathematical relationship between the public key and the private key, which works in a way that anyone could encrypt information with your public key, but only you could decrypt this information with your private key. So if you have just the private key, if you have just the public key of somebody, it should not be mathematically possible to obtain the private key based on that, or to decrypt the information based on just the public key, right? So what happens in the communication that we were looking at a moment ago? You want to send something to your friend on the right. So what you would do in this case is you would encrypt the information with their public key. So this means that this information, in order for anyone to decrypt this information, they need to have the private key, and no one has the private key apart from the recipient of this information, right? Or that data. This means that their public key might be, as the name implies, as the name says, publicly available, right? So anyone could have their public key, but they cannot decrypt this information with their public key. So only the recipient of this information can decrypt it using their own private key. Obviously, this is more sophisticated in the way it works compared to symmetric encryption. But the downside that we've already mentioned is the fact that it requires more resources in order to achieve this type of encryption. So if, again, we step into the information technology world, then this means that the downside here is that it's slower compared to symmetric encryption. Okay. All right. I'll talk to you in a bit. Thank you.